Let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're diving into something truly profound, the deep psychological and theological impacts of social trauma. We're going to look really closely at how systemic social oppression creates actual physical wounds in people. But more importantly, we're exploring a powerful call for the church to step up and become who they are truly meant to be. If you've ever felt the sting of exclusion, or maybe watched a community just fracture under the weight of unresolved pain, this deep dive into Kelsey Waters' incredible research is an absolute game changer. It gives us a completely new framework for understanding and ultimately for healing the body of Christ.
Waters actually begins her research not with a bunch of clinical data, but with a deeply moving personal story. Picture this. You're walking across a freezing college campus on a bitterly cold evening. The author, who happens to be a student without sight, was offered a guiding arm by a kind gentleman. As they walked together, she sensed this profound loneliness in him. When she asked about his experience on campus, he confessed how incredibly isolating it was to be a student of color there. Right in that moment, she just reached out and said, "I hear you." Because as a blind student navigating a world that literally wasn't built for her, she knew exactly what it felt like to be treated as other. They were two strangers, yet their bodies and spirits instantly recognized a shared struggle. That unspoken, instant solidarity, that is the heartbeat of what we're unpacking today.
And it's that profound human connection that really grounds the rigorous academic research we're looking at. Originating from the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University, this paper takes a deep dive into pastoral care and social work. It asks a question that affects every single one of us. How does systemic social oppression, things like racism, sexism, ableism, create real, unhealed trauma within our communities? And crucially, how does this unhealed trauma actively wound the spiritual community?
So first things first, we need to actually define the injury here, which is social trauma. Look, we aren't just talking about everyday stress or having a fleeting bad mood. Social trauma is an actual traumatic injury that accumulates in the body because of systemic, ongoing injustices. Think about it. When a person is constantly subjected to microaggressions, discrimination, or just an environment that treats them as less than, that stress builds up. It's a deep emotional injury inflicted by external conditions of oppression, and it seriously disrupts normal human functioning. Now, standard models of trauma, like PTSD, they usually focus on a physically life-threatening event, right? Extreme physical danger. But social trauma is rooted in sudden, uncontrollable, and relentless emotional pain. It's like the daily paper cuts of bias that eventually grow into gaping wounds. The research notes that by relying on only the classic PTSD model, professionals and ministers often completely miss the traumatic stress caused by social oppression. Why? Well, simply because there isn't always a single physically dangerous event to point your finger at. To understand how this emotional pain actually becomes physical, the research draws on the work of psychologist Resmananicum. He explains that trauma embeds itself in what he beautifully calls the soul nerve. Clinically, you might know this as the vagus nerve. It's this massive nerve system that connects our deepest human emotions directly to our bodily organs, our gut, our heart, our lungs. This soul nerve doesn't speak English. It operates entirely through physical sensations, gut feelings, and vibes. So when a marginalized person experiences oppression, their soul nerve absorbs that danger physically. And here is where it gets incredibly challenging for us. This soul nerve totally bypasses our logical thinking mind and connects directly to the lizard brain, basically the brainstem. And let me tell you, the lizard brain does not care about your rational thoughts. It solely concerns itself with instinctual safety and survival. When social oppression happens, the lizard brain locks a physical fight, flight, or freeze response deep inside the body. You literally can't just think your way out of it. Until that bodily trauma is actively addressed and settled, it stays stuck, just wreaking havoc on a person's health and well-being. Understanding how that trauma is processed brings us to another one of Menachem's key concepts: clean pain versus dirty pain. Clean pain takes immense courage. It's that ache you feel when you step into the unknown to do the right thing, confronting biases or processing trauma so that actual healing can happen. Dirty pain, on the flip side, is rooted entirely in avoidance and denial. The research argues that when people react from their most wounded selves, pushing unhealed trauma onto others through blame, anger, or apathy, they're caught in dirty pain. And when folks refuse to face their own complicity in social oppression, that dirty pain spreads like wildfire. When social trauma is left unhealed and that dirty pain takes over, the symptoms manifest holistically across a person's entire life. It completely cripples emotional well-being, leading to numbness, deep anxiety, and pent-up anger. It causes severe somatic or physical issues like tension, migraines, and chronic body aches. Relationally, it creates isolation and severe distrust, usually born from a constant need to guard against the dominant culture. And spiritually, it causes people to deeply question their faith in both God and humanity. Now, the research elevates this from a clinical issue to a severe theological crisis. The author powerfully argues that unhealed social trauma actively divides and wounds the mystical body of Christ. Think about that for a second. When the church ignores systemic oppression or fails to recognize the social trauma carried by its marginalized members, it becomes a broken, wounded body. It's bleeding with the torn flesh of division and disharmony. This means that social trauma isn't just some political or social issue. The paper frames it as a fundamental contradiction of Christian theology itself. To drive this home, the paper points right to 1 Corinthians chapter 12 to remind us of our absolute interdependence. If one part suffers, all the parts suffer with it. The author argues that the church simply cannot claim to be a healthy spiritual body if it turns a blind eye to the traumatic stress being inflicted on its most vulnerable parts. Ignoring the social trauma of marginalized groups, whether that's people of color, those with disabilities, or the impoverished, contradicts the very essence of Christian solidarity. We're reminded that the church is actually meant to practice a preferential option for the oppressed, treating those suffering parts with even greater care. So how do we find a solution? The author calls the church to look at a very familiar figure in a completely new light, Mary, the mother of Jesus, specifically in her song of praise, the Magnificat. Too often, Mary is portrayed as passively submissive, mild, and quiet, but a closer theological look reveals a woman of radical, fierce solidarity. She was a poor, marginalized woman who issued a powerful, divine no to oppressive conditions. Her song praises a God who casts down the mighty and lifts up the lowly. The paper asserts that if the church really wants to heal and be what it's meant to be, it must adopt this exact model of radical strength and solidarity against social oppression. Furthermore, liberation theology offers a profound reframing of Christ himself. Rather than a safe, mild-mannered figure you might see in a stained glass window, this theology emphasizes Jesus as a marginalized outcast. He was a man of color living under Roman occupation, he was poor, he was persecuted, and he literally bore the physical and social marks of systemic oppression. The research really highlights that he didn't just observe social trauma from a comfortable distance, he lived it and suffered it in his very own body. Which naturally raises a profound question. How does encountering a marginalized Jesus actually change our ministry? The research argues that if we truly recognize that God suffers directly alongside the socially oppressed, we have to move past those shallow platitudes. It means no longer telling people to just get over it or casually dismissing their pain. Instead, it requires entering into a deep, highly aware solidarity with them, recognizing their inherent gifts rather than just pitying their wounds. This all leads to a super practical 3-step pastoral solution called accompaniment, modeled right on the spiritual journey of the Paschal Mystery. Stage 1, death, involves dying to our own egos, recognizing our complicity in oppressive structures, and listening deeply to a traumatized person's story without jumping in to fix it immediately. Stage 2, resurrection, means walking with them to find resilience and hope in the divine promise of healing and liberation. And finally, Stage 3, ascension, focuses on empowering the person by helping them recognize their own inner strengths and building up their support systems to move forward with real agency. It's a structured, incredibly compassionate framework to walk someone out of that dirty pain and into clean pain. Ultimately, this research leaves us with a vital choice. Are we going to allow our communities to remain complacent, avoiding the uncomfortable truths of systemic oppression and letting wounds fester in dirty pain? Or will we courageously choose the clean pain, doing the hard, necessary work of recognizing privilege, standing in radical solidarity with the marginalized, and actively working to heal the body of Christ? Stepping into that clean pain is presented as the absolute only way the church can become the unified, healing body it was always meant to be. So what will it take for us to finally step into the unknown and start mending? It definitely leaves us with a whole lot to think about.